Why do British institutions and prominent British voices feel that they can be casually critical of India and Hindus especially? It often feels as though India and Hindus live rent-free, as they say these days, in the brains of the British media. Why does India, an India that's reverting to pre-colonial Bharat, receive so much negative press from British politicians and especially from British media? It's a question that was taxing me for a while. And so I've done a bit of research which I'd like to share with you. And I came across a concept called the Colonial Gaze. It's a way of looking. It's looking through a mental lens when what is seen is coloured by the lens. And the colonizer's lens is vitally important if we are to improve relationships in today's global village. Understanding the colonizer's lens is vitally important if we're to improve relationships in today's global village. The colonial gaze refers to the way colonial powers like Britain and India viewed and represented colonized peoples and cultures, and they did so through a lens of superiority, exoticism, and control. It's a framework which was rooted in power dynamics, where the colonizer constructs the colonized as other, and then uses this to justify domination, exploitation, and even cultural erasure. This concept draws from post-colonial theory, particularly Edward Said's Orientalism, which critiques how the West portrayed the East as backward, mysterious, or inferior to assert its own authority. Britain and India have a particular relationship, and we can see the colonizer's gaze in action in many spheres of interaction. British colonial narratives depicted India as a land of mysticism, chaos, and primitivism, contrasting it with Britain's self-image as rational, modern, and civilized. This is evident in literature, in art, and indeed in travelogues, such as Rudyard Kipling's works, or paintings of exotic Indian landscapes and peoples. Indians were often stereotyped as lazy, superstitious, or morally inferior, and this reinforced the idea that British rule was necessary, therefore, to civilize them. The term white man's burden encapsulated this paternalistic justification. The colonial gaze impacted upon knowledge production and control. The British systematically studied and documented Indian culture, languages, and traditions, but did so through a colonial lens. For example, institutions like the Asiatic Society, of which I'm a fellow, founded in 1784, catalogued Indian texts and histories, often misinterpreting them, occasionally reshaping them deliberately to fit Western frameworks. The act of knowing India gave Britain symbolic power, positioning the colonizer as the authority over Indian identity. Maps, censuses, and legal codes, for example, the Permanent Settlement of 1793, further imposed British structures on Indian society, erasing local nuances. The colonizer's gaze extended to visual arts, where Indian bodies and landscapes were objectified. British artists painted Indian princes, bazaars, or temples as exotic spectacles for European audiences, stripping them of humanity, agency, and context. Photography, especially in the 19th century, was used to document Indian types, castes, tribes, and other labels in ethnographic studies, again reducing individuals from human beings to specimens for colonial scrutiny. The colonizer's gaze often fixated on Indian women, portraying them as either submissive, e.g. veiled purdah women, or hypersexualized, for example, temple dancers. Practices like sati, widow immolation, were sensationalized, extrapolated, and amplified to demonize Indian culture, justifying British intervention, such as the 1829 ban on sati. This gendered colonial lens ignored Indian women's agency and reinforced colonial control over their bodies and social roles. The gaze wasn't just cultural. It underpinned economic exploitation. By framing India as a resource-rich but chaotic, disordered land, Britain justified extracting wealth, for example, through the East India Company's trade monopolies, or indigo plantations, or the fields from which the opium wars were fueled, whilst at the same time claiming to bring order. Politically, the colonizer gaze dehumanized Indian resistance. In 1857, the rebellion was titled the Sepoy Mutiny, for instance, and it was portrayed as a savage rebellion rather than a legitimate uprising, portrayal legitimizing brutal British reprisals. The impacts on colonized nations are still to be felt today. The impacts on India are manifold. Cultural erasure. The colonizers' gaze marginalized indigenous knowledge systems, indigenous languages and traditions, and at the same time elevated English education, and Western norms. For example, Macaulay's 1835 Minute on Education. One of the other impacts of this colonial gaze in the area of education was to internalize inferiority. Over time, some Indians internalized these narratives, adopting Western standards of progress or beauty, a phenomenon which Frantz Fanon later described as colonial psychological alienation. This is still with us. It's present today. Resistance and reclamation to this gaze was widespread. Indian intellectuals like Savarkar and later nationalists like Sitaram Goyal challenged the colonizers' gaze at every opportunity, creating a new narrative in an attempt to reclaim and reintegrate an Indian identity through cultural revival and political activism. The colonizers' gaze didn't end with Indian independence in 1947. It lingered in post-colonial stereotypes, and in fact it's present even today. Only a few days ago, Sam Bidwell, director of the Adam Smith Institute, wrote an article on the Indian diaspora, an article entitled Riding the Tiger, which cast a critical eye on the Indian diaspora's influence within what he calls the Anglosphere. And he frames the influence as a destabilizing force. His article suggests that our integration and success threaten cultural cohesion, particularly in Britain. It's difficult not to smile at this shallow perspective. It's steeped in irony and hypocrisy, given Britain's historical and ongoing moral failings which strip it of any authority to judge others. If shame was a feature of the colonizer identity, we would not be having articles of this nature published. Britain, as a former colonial power, has orchestrated 42 illegal regime change operations across the globe, from Iran in 1953 to Libya in 2011. It's left a trail of chaos, exploitation, and suffering. These interventions, again often justified under the guise of civilizing missions, reveal a nation more concerned with power and resources than principles. The Indian diaspora, many of whom are descendants of those people subjected to British colonial rule, owe no apology for thriving in spaces their ancestors were once plundered to build. To criticize their success, while ignoring Britain's role in creating the conditions for their migration, is not just selective amnesia, it's moral bankruptcy. Consider for a moment Tony Blair, Sir Tony Blair, architect of the Iraq War, a war which was built on lies, those mysterious weapons of mass destruction, lies that killed hundreds of thousands and destabilized an entire region of the globe. Tony Blair walks free, knighted, and prosperous, while the British state deflects accountability. This alone obliterates any claim to ethical superiority. If Britain can't hold its own leaders to account, what right do British commentators have to scrutinize the Indian diaspora's contributions or loyalties? Worse still, the British government has failed its own citizens in ways that expose its genuine and true priorities. For decades, vulnerable working-class girls in towns like Rotherham and Rochdale, 50 towns, were abandoned to systematic gang rape by organised networks, with the authorities turning a blind eye. Over 1,400 victims in Rotherham alone suffered, while police and councils dithered. They allegedly prioritised political correctness, although now there are suspicions that they were complicit. A state that cannot protect its vulnerable daughters lacks the standing to lecture any community on integration or values. Sam Bidwell's articles' insinuations about the diaspora's influence also ring hollow in a Britain where freedom of speech is eroding on a daily basis. In recent years, we've seen arrests for offensive social media posts. A woman praying silently, standing by a wall, arrested. A man detained in 2024 for sharing an image deemed grossly offensive. Journalists face harassment and dissenters are silenced through vague laws or social ostracism. If Britain cannot tolerate open discourse within its borders, its complaints about external influences sound like projection, not principle. The British Indian diaspora, far from riding the tiger, has navigated a hostile world with resilience, contributing economically, culturally, and intellectually to nations that once colonized them, enslaved them, exploited them. In 2023, British Indians had a median household income of almost £40,000, higher than the national average of £32,000, and their academic attainment consistently outpaces other groups. To frame this success as a threat rather than a triumph betrays a deeper insecurity, one history reveals all too clearly. British elites have long maintained their sense of self-worth by refusing to acknowledge the worth of the non-British worthy. From the largest plunder of India's wealth, estimated at $45 trillion in today's terms, to the present, where contributions of the diaspora are met with suspicion, the pattern endures. The colonizer's gaze adopted by Sam Bidwell and his ilk is one which assumes the moral right to go into kinship groups, nations, and civilizations, bearing only a limited understanding of the cultures and the civilizations, and indeed their history. The article's critique is not a defense of culture, but it's a tired echo of empire, a refusal to share the stage with those whose brilliance exposes Britain's fading moral and material dominance. If the world is to be healed of the hatred which fueled colonial enslavement and exploitation, voices from the colonial nations need to work harder to remove this colonizer gaze, this colonial lens. And audiences in colonized nations must recognize that this colonizer complex still exists in Western institutions and especially in Western media. For those who are still not convinced about the existence of this colonizer gaze, I'd just like to quote Churchill. Churchill was giving evidence to the Peel Commission, and he stated, "I do not agree that the dog in a manger has the final right to the manger, even though he may have lain there for a very long time. I do not admit that right. I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more worldly race, to put it that way, has come in and taken their place."